start. Good afternoon, family.
Hey.
Welcome to a loving circle of small R. I need to move over here.
Yeah. Please no.
No, move over this way.
Sorry, sir.
I'm confused.
You can move there.
One down? Okay. So I consider us a family of small R, big E revolutionaries.
Yes.
And it's been really beautiful to be here in this space with you all, because I really feel like there's some dreaming energy that's being produced here that's going to nourish me as I go back to the work that I'm trying to do on the ground as I return. You can go to the next slide. So you look at this picture, this notion of the interconnected web of life, and you see a double reality that's interrelated. So on the one side you have the green grass, and on the other side you have the parched landscape. So when you think about climate change and our agenda of trying to keep climate change, the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, Africana people have been demanding since the beginning of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we keep the climate temperature at 1 degree Celsius, and where people aren't listening to us. So a very critical question is, when they don't listen, what do we do next? I'm not sure I'll really talk about that a whole lot in this presentation, but it might come up in the dialogue that we have after. We can go on to the next slide. So a little bit about me. I always have to start with the people who got me here. So I am the son of Sam and Alice, who were both small R, big E revolutionaries. And they were produced by people before them and generations before. And as a young child, I had the great benefit of living in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I went to the same church as Nyerere. So he was my early example of what it means to be a black man on the planet. And then we had living in our home when he was, quote-unquote, on sabbatical, training his forces for the revolution in Mozambique, Eduardo Mondlane. So he was my uncle. So I had two of my favorite people in world history as people who were very close to me. So that's one place to start. I'm not nearly as beautiful, brilliant, and bold a man as either one of them, but I do my pitiful best. So among my pitiful practices in Africa, I'm doing bottom-up eco-village organizing and development in West Africa primarily, working in traditional villages that are being terribly impacted by climate change, and using an eco-village organizing and agroecology paradigm to help people begin to set conditions in their own soil for a healthy livelihood, and then begin to develop that mycorrhizal structure across villages all across the country and all across West Africa, so that we're taking care of ourselves and each other through a convivial, bottom-up orientation, which is very, anarchical. And then the questions that come up is, as the pressures on the sub-imperial states across Africa begin to make them come to the land and begin to take away the means of life, what do we do in relationship to that? And so we're still kind of dealing with those critical questions. And then here in the United States, there's a very different reality. I'm working on trying to also do eco-village organizing and development, and I'm a professor and I'm teaching climate justice and environmental justice, and getting my students involved in carbon sequestration research projects on a demonstration farm, and then I'm having them help me with eco-village organizing project in North Minneapolis, which is one of our very oppressed communities. Next slide. Oh, go back for 1 second. So at the top here, what I'm going to end my talk with is about my own dream, my own description of the utopia that I'm seeking, which is an integral, intercultural, ecological democracy. So I'll say a little bit about what that might look like if we can actually move there together. So now you go on. So I really appreciate the World-Ecology framework that Jason Moore has pulled together, and that a lot of you as colleagues have helped to sort of nourish. Because I really feel like when we pay attention to all these binaries and the separation of ourselves from nature, what we do is kind of add layers of stupidity on layers of stupidity. Everything is in fact related to everything else. Humans are part of nature, and so everything we create is also part of nature. Whether we like it or not is not the point. So I accept the theses of the Capitalocene. I also accept the theses and appreciate the theses of the racial Capitalocene. But given my own personal history, growing up fighting apartheid in South Africa, and then deciding, oh, you know what, what's happening in South Africa is a global system, fighting global apartheid, I decided, just to be playful, not to have an argument with you about the merits of it, but just to be playful, I decided to call this epic the Apartheidocene. Using Vandana Shiva's orientation to eco-apartheid as the framework, so I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. Go ahead. So capitalism is a way of organizing nature, and it's co-production of nature, the pursuit of power, and the accumulation of capital altogether. Go on. I'm going to go through some of these pretty darn fast. In Jason Moore's dissertation, he nailed it, and he also said it in his presentation yesterday, that modern racism was born of the transatlantic slave trade, the human pivot of the sugar commodity frontier, and as we understand the emergence of capitalism, the basis of African lands and lives as the primitive accumulation base of capitalism, not only was it there at the beginning, it's there now. So we remain the primitive accumulation base of capital, with very little voice in the matter, right? So go on to the next slide. I don't know how many of you have read the political ecologist Diane Rochelot, who's done a lot of work with people on the ground in East Africa, but I appreciate her notion of calling the way we live on the land diverse nature cultures. And so one critique I'm bringing from her, from our way of thinking about the Capitalocene, is to recognize that there are numerous nature cultures co-occurring, co-arising on the planet right now. While we all have to relate to the capitalist system, it doesn't mean that our totality is defined by that. We have other ways of identifying ourselves in the world, and the challenge through interculturalism is to braid our different intersubjective and experiential understandings of the world to promote the forms of agony and bliss that allow us to form genuine communion on the earth and in relation with each other. We'll go on to the next one. So, Frantz Fanon, who is one of my favorite theorists of all time, talked about the zone of non-being. And somebody in a talk earlier talked about Orlando Patterson's work, which I also appreciate. But Fanon says that if you are a colonized person, what it means to be a colonized person is to be disappeared. So you live in the zone of non-being. Your land is taken from you. Earlier presentation talks about the Lebensraum, the ecological space. Your ecological space is taken. You no longer have the freedom to live on your own terms on your land. And so the challenge of a colonized person is either to copy the example of the colonizer or to transcend the example of the colonizer. So a lot of this work is about trying to transcend that example. And so in my research, I'm looking at the long history since 1415 of Africana peoples on the planet and putting it in the context of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that came out in 2005. And I'm using all of the logic of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to show how an integral intercultural ecological democracy actually is the only way to answer the questions of these 24 ecosystem services. Because while the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, you can go on to the next slide, broke it down 3 areas of ecosystems into 24 ecosystem services, according to their assessment, 15 of these ecosystem services are in significantly degraded status. Now, my own research into these ecosystem services says all 24 are in significantly degraded status because capitalism cannot do anything except continue to degrade nature. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is an eco-modernist, orientation to science. And so this is a whole other aspect of this work. And the apartheid scene, we need to critique neoliberal science. And a question for us is how do we move towards democratic, open science, which is truly participatory. I've been on panels talking about indigenous science as science, and people said, no. What indigenous people do is ethno-science, not real science. And I said, I won't swear because it's being videotaped. Actually, modernist science is ethno-science, right? So what I'm looking for is a genuine democratic science that actually transcends the ethnosphere and comes to the ecosphere. So ecospheric science, how do we do that? We can only do it through mutuality. So here are some of the ecosystem services. In the interest of time, I'll just blow through this. Slides in the deck, so I think everybody can get a copy of it later. Go to the next one. Some of my work ends up focusing on agroecology, sort of bottom-up livelihood facilitation and organization. So, what's on this particular page ends up being really relevant in my work, and several people here are long-standing, passionate agroecologists, so I look forward to collaborating with you going forward. Keep going. So, in the ecosystem assessment, there's many things missing. While they talk about biodiversity, they talk about biodiversity as a thing. And I think an earlier presentation sort of talked about when you have an indigenous language, the language itself is a living being, right? And so all of those plants and animals and their associations are all alive. And so how do we begin to interpret that and work from that as we do our mutual science with each other? It's an important question. So I feel like all the questions of energy sovereignty and food sovereignty are largely left out of the way that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was framed, although scientists did begin to make an effort, particularly where there was strong pushback by the indigenous people. So in Ecuador and Bolivia, the higher expression of intercultural science did emerge through the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, not in other places around the planet. So as we think about transitioning from the industrial food system through linked agroecologies, how do we move towards a polycultural world ecology? This is a question I'm passionate about. Go on. So in my research right now, I'm looking at, oh my God, keep on getting in my own way here.
Put
Put it on that side.
Yeah.
Is it going to be long enough? Yep, it is. Right. All right, now you're safe. Safe for my presentation. So at the bottom, I'm looking at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. It's a civil society formation composed of more than 1,000 organizations all over the continent, doing really brilliant work, interrogating the African climate negotiators, working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, working with each of the governments across the continent, and then also doing grassroots leadership and civil society organizing. I'm looking at La Via Campesina, I'm looking at the movement for the survival of Ogoni people, and then looking at the global climate justice movement as a movement of movements. I'll go on to the next slide. Only got 4 minutes left. So global apartheid at the bottom, the opposite of global democracy. Next slide. There's an agency of this structure of oppression that we're all imbricated in, the capitalist and ecological imperialist core, generating all across Africa and other oppressed spaces on the planet these sub-imperial elites who take advantage of their people on behalf of their commitment to compliance with a regime of oppression and marginalization. And then you have at the bottom the outcomes of that: increasing debt, increasing genocide, increasing ecocide. Next slide. If you want to reverse that, what's exciting for me is how many forms of resistance are alive on the planet that we are not dialoguing with each other about that. There's actually an amazing network of things that are emerging all across the planet. If we could just connect them more, we could really do much better movement building. So deterritorializing, go back. So deterritorializing systems of oppression and fostering conditions for enduring mutualities. This is the question of my on-the-ground research. How is that looking? How is that feeling? How do we do more of that? Now you can go on. So we need to move from ecosystems of harm, which cause the eco-cultural degradations, towards, next slide. Keep going. Keep going. So here we are at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I'm going to do this ridiculously fast. But what I love about this particular framework is it says there's 8 irreducible perspectives. I, as a person, have an inside perspective. As I interpret the world, I'm doing it in relationship to you. How are you interpreting the world, and how am I internalizing that? I have a cultural we. How is my cultural we interpreting our world in relation to the way you're thinking about the world? And then what does it look like to go from my small cultural we to the bigger intercultural we? We're paying attention to the desire to reclaim our land. You're paying attention to your desire to keep taking our land. How do we deal with that dynamic of the dialectical interplay of systems of taking and systems of trying to practice reciprocity? And then finally, how do we grow a different convivial world? So these are the kind of questions that emerge when you use this integral framework. And I think that Ken Wilber made it difficult. I think we can make it really simple. Go on. Keep going. I've only got 2 minutes left. Keep going. Just jump towards the end. Keep going. Keep going. Stop here for a second. Okay. So Vandana Shika talks about eco-apartheid as having 3 fundamental aspects. Divide from nature, divide from each other, and when you have a world system based on division from nature and each other, what happens is that your own spirit becomes divided. You become a reinforcing fractal of a world of division. So for me, the key thing I want us to pay attention to is this notion that anarchists are the best descriptors and embodiers of, which is mutuality. So what's the antidote? I really want to talk about replacing the capitalocene with the mutualocene. Okay, keep going. Keep going. So here's a picture of what happens with the apartheid-ocene. Division from nature, division from each other, division from self and spirit. And the alternative is intercultural ecological democracy, working together on the ecological commons, and then cultural self-determination and bottom-up eco-autonomous formations in communities across the planet. So this is the vision I'm trying to describe. How do we actually grow the tracks for that? Skip that. This work, this is from Boaventura Santos, but I really like the way he talks about the 5 ecologies, but I'll skip that for now. So this is an important point to close on. The world is full of ecologies of knowledge. And what we're lacking is the skill set to do the intercultural translation, because we don't know how to talk to each other. And so for me, the sweetest form of open science right now that I'm trying to live in the space of is trying to foster conditions for that open science and convivial renorming of the way we relate to each other and the planet. Last slide. Keep going. Get to the end. And this one. So, yeah, go to the next one. So I'm out of time now. So I want us to, one choice is to continue eco-apartheid. I don't think any of us want to do that. The preferred choice is for all of us to learn how to be midwives together. And I was talking to Diana the other day and bragging about the fact that I brought 9 babies into the world. And I think all of us need to bring this baby of an intercultural ecological democracy into the world together. And I look forward to our collaboration in that regard. Thank you.